Heat has a strange way of making a road feel honest. It bends the air above the asphalt, erases the distance, and turns a four-lane highway into something that looks like it might go on forever. On a burnt orange evening somewhere along the southern edge of the American map, that heat sat heavy on a stretch of two-lane blacktop, where nothing moved but the wind and the occasional truck hauling produce north. Then came the sound, not one engine, 12, maybe 15. A low mechanical thunder that arrived long before the machines did, rolling across the flatland the way a storm announces itself in the distance. Ranch dogs lifted their heads. A man loading crates behind a roadside store stopped what he was doing and simply waited, because there was nothing else to do. They came through in a loose double column, chrome catching what was left of the sun, cut-off vests worn over sunburned shoulders, a winged skull stitched across every back. The same patch, the same colors, the same silent message that had been understood on 5 continents for the better part of 70 years. We do not ask, we arrive. For most of the 20th century, that arrival was enough. Small towns emptied their sidewalks. Bar owners quietly closed early. Rival clubs folded, absorbed, or disappeared. The organization that grew out of a few California garages in 1948 became something no one had planned for and almost nobody could stop. A network with chapters in dozens of countries, an internal discipline that rivaled any military unit, and a reputation so heavy that it did most of the work before a single fist was raised. And that reputation is exactly where the trouble started. Because somewhere south of that highway, past the fences and the checkpoints and the river, there existed a different kind of organization. One that did not ride in formation, one that did not need a logo, one that had spent decades building something the bikers never fully understood until it was far too late. The cartels did not care about legend. They cared about arithmetic. And over the next few decades, in port cities and desert towns, in Canadian suburbs and European harbors, in Australian warehouses and Scandinavian clubhouses, the men in the winged skull patches would learn a lesson the hard way, over and over again, in 10 different countries, in 10 different ways. Reputation is a currency, and currencies collapse. To understand why, you have to understand what the club actually was, because the public image and the operating reality were two very different things. From the outside, it looked like rebellion. Leather engines, a refusal to be governed. That image was cultivated deliberately over decades, and it was extraordinarily effective because it recruited a certain kind of young man, and it frightened a certain kind of everyone else. From the inside, it was a franchise system. Chapters operated with local autonomy under a shared brand. Membership required a probationary period that functioned as a vetting process. Rules were enforced internally with a severity that most legitimate institutions could never get away with. Dues were collected, meetings were held, minutes were, in some cases, actually taken. There were regional officers, national officers, and international coordination that spanned time zones. It was, structurally, a corporation that had accidentally been designed by outlaws, and for a long time that structure was its greatest strength. It could absorb losses, replace leadership, and expand into new markets faster than any loose criminal network could. But every structure carries the seed of its own failure, and this one carried an enormous one. The whole thing depended on being known. Membership meant wearing the symbol. Territory meant announcing it. Authority meant that everyone in a region understood exactly who you were and what would happen if they crossed you. Take away visibility and the entire model stops functioning, because the deterrent evaporates the moment nobody can tell who they are dealing with. Now hold that thought, because the organizations they were about to encounter had built their entire existence on the exact opposite principle. This is the story of what happened when a motorcycle club that had spent 70 years being the most feared thing in the room walked into rooms where nobody had ever heard of them, and nobody cared to. Stay with me, because the 10th one changes how you look at the other 9. Montreal in February does not forgive anybody. The snow comes sideways off the river and packs into the seams of the sidewalks until the whole city feels like it has been shrink-wrapped in gray. The East End goes quiet by 9. steam rises from the vents behind the restaurants on Ontario Street, and for a long stretch of the 1990s, in the back rooms of those restaurants, some of the most profitable criminal arithmetic in the Western Hemisphere was being worked out over espresso and cigarettes. Here's what almost nobody outside the business understood at the time. The Port of Montreal was a doorway. Containers came in from South America by the tens of thousands, and inside a fraction of those containers was product that had begun its life as a leaf on a hillside 4,000 miles away. Somebody had to receive it. Somebody had to move it inland. Somebody had to turn a compressed brick into cash spread across 100 street corners in 100 neighborhoods. The bikers were extraordinarily good at that last part. What they were not good at was remembering who actually owned the product. The arrangement worked on a word that sounds harmless until you understand what it costs. Consignment. The suppliers fronted the load. The distributors moved it. The money came back up the chain within an agreed number of days. Nobody signed anything. Nobody could. The entire structure rested on a single assumption that the people at the bottom of the chain would always pay. For years, they did. Then the club went to war with itself. Not with the cartels, with other bikers, a brutal internal and regional conflict over territory that turned Quebec into something no Canadian had ever imagined possible. Car bombs on residential streets, gunfights in restaurant parking lots, a body count that climbed past 150 and eventually took the life of an 11-year-old boy who had done nothing but stand near the wrong parked vehicle. The war made headlines. It also made a problem nobody upstairs had accounted for. Money stops moving during a war. Distribution networks fracture. Street-level operators get arrested, killed, or simply stop showing up. Cash that was supposed to travel north to south in 9 days started taking 30, then 60. Then it stopped arriving at all, and several thousand kilometers away, in offices that looked nothing like clubhouses, people who had never once ridden a motorcycle looked at a spreadsheet and saw a number in red. Here's the part that gets misunderstood in every retelling of this story. The suppliers did not send an army. They did not launch a spectacular act of revenge. They did something far more devastating and far quieter. They turned off the tap. No product, no credit, no conversation. The containers that had been arriving with predictable regularity simply stopped containing anything worth receiving. Phone numbers went dead. Intermediaries stopped answering. Middlemen who had spent a decade brokering these relationships suddenly found themselves unable to get anyone on the line. Within a single season, an organization that had been the single most profitable criminal enterprise in Canadian history discovered it had no inventory. You cannot intimidate a supply chain. You cannot put a gun to a shipping schedule. And you absolutely cannot fight a war against people who have decided you are no longer worth the phone call. The clubhouses stayed open. The patches stayed on. The engines still made that same thunder rolling down Notre Dame. But the machine underneath had been quietly unplugged from 4,000 miles away by men whose names most of those bikers never even learned. By the time the police operations of the early 2000s swept through and put dozens behind bars, the financial damage had already been done. The arrests finished a body that was already bleeding out. That was the first lesson, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. The cartels did not need to beat them, they only needed to stop feeding them. 3,000 miles west, the mountains do something strange to sound. British Columbia's interior swallows noise. You can stand on a logging road above a valley in the Fraser Canyon and hear absolutely nothing, no highway, no aircraft, no town. Just wind moving through cedar. It is one of the most beautiful and most isolated pieces of geography in North America. And for roughly 30 years, it was also one of the most valuable pieces of criminal real estate on the planet. The reason was agriculture. British Columbia grew a product of exceptional quality in enormous volume, in a jurisdiction where getting caught rarely meant serious prison time. Down south, a very different product was being manufactured in industrial quantities by organizations that had every reason to want a northern market. So somebody built a swap, not a sale. A swap product moving south across the 49th parallel, a different product moving north in the same trucks, the same compartments, the same crews. Two commodities, Two directions, one pipeline. Nobody had to carry cash across an international border, which solved the single most dangerous problem in the entire trade. For the club chapters that controlled the distribution end of that pipeline, it was the closest thing to a perpetual motion machine that the underworld has ever produced. And like everything else in this story, it worked beautifully until somebody got comfortable. Comfort in that business looks like a very specific set of behaviors. Loads arriving light and nobody explaining why. Quality dropping and the explanation always being someone else's fault. Timelines slipping by a day, then 3, then a week. Local operators skimming off the top and assuming the volume was large enough that nobody would notice. Somebody always notices. What the northern distributors had failed to understand is that the organizations they were dealing with had, by the mid-2000s, evolved into something that behaved less like a gang and more like a logistics corporation. They had accountants, they had auditors, they had people whose entire job was reconciling what left a warehouse against what arrived at a destination. And they were extremely good at that job because in their world, an accounting error is not a bad quarter. It is a mass grave, so they sent people north, not gunmen, observers, quiet men who rented ordinary cars and stayed in ordinary hotels and spent several weeks doing nothing but watching, counting trucks, timing crossings, identifying who actually handled the product versus who merely claimed to, building a map of a network that the bikers themselves had never bothered to write down. And when that map was finished, the response was surgical. Certain crews stopped receiving anything. Others suddenly found themselves offered better terms, direct terms, that bypassed the patched members entirely and went straight to the people who actually did the work. The organization discovered with a shock that took years to fully register that a significant portion of its own distribution network had been quietly recruited out from under it by an employer offering better rates and fewer rules. You do not need to defeat an organization if you can simply hire it. Within a few years, chapters that had once dictated terms to everyone in the province found themselves as one option among several, not the boss. A vendor, replaceable. Some of them never accepted it. A handful pushed back, and the pushback ended in ways that made the local news for a week and then disappeared. But the deeper humiliation was not violent at all. It was economic. It was watching a business you thought you owned get politely, professionally, and permanently taken apart by people who never once raised their voices. The mountains stayed quiet, the valley stayed beautiful, and the pipeline kept running, just not for the men who thought they controlled it. There is a particular kind of arrogance that only comes from never having lost. By the early 2000s, chapters across the American Southwest had spent decades operating with near total dominance over their environment. Rival clubs had been absorbed or crushed. Local law enforcement in small desert counties was chronically underfunded and frequently outmatched. Bars, tattoo shops, security work, protection arrangements, and the movement of methamphetamine through the region had all fallen under a structure that answered to nobody within 400 miles. So when certain individuals started looking south, toward the border, the logic seemed obvious to them. The margins on domestically produced product were shrinking. The margins on imported product were enormous. The border was right there. Why pay a middleman when you could simply go get it yourself? It is the same reasoning that has destroyed 1,000 ambitious criminals. It treats a supply chain as though it were a shelf you could reach. What those men had not internalized is that the corridors running north out of Sonora and Chihuahua and Tamaulipas were not open territory. They were owned, not in the loose way a motorcycle club owns a bar. Owned in the sense that a specific organization had, over the course of decades, purchased or terrorized every level of infrastructure along a specific route. The ranchers whose land the road crossed, the drivers, the mechanics, the fuel stops, the customs officials, the municipal police, the guys who watched the crossing from a hilltop with a radio and got paid whether or not anything happened that day. That is not a smuggling route. That is a functioning parallel government. And into that parallel government walked a handful of men who had, quite genuinely, come to believe that the patch on their back constituted a form of authority. The first meetings, by every account, were cordial. That is worth understanding, because it is where the misreading began. These organizations are not stupid. When an unknown party approaches with a proposal, the intelligent response is to listen, to smile, to ask polite questions, and to learn absolutely everything about who you're talking to before deciding anything. The bikers mistook the politeness for weakness. They mistook the listening for interest. Terms were floated. Volumes were discussed. And somewhere in those conversations, someone made the fatal error of framing the proposal as though the Southern organization needed a partner rather than the other way around. There is no faster way to end a conversation. What followed was not a war. Wars require two parties with comparable capacity, and there was never anything comparable about it. What followed was a demonstration. A load that had been paid for did not arrive. When questions were asked, the questions were not answered. When representatives were sent to ask the questions in person, they were received with great courtesy, given food and water, and sent home with a message that has been repeated in various forms across this entire story for 40 years. You are not partners, you are customers. And you are only customers for as long as we find that convenient. The men who came back understood something that day that no amount of reputation could soften. They had walked into a room believing they were the most dangerous thing in it, and discovered that the most dangerous thing in the room had already counted them, priced them, and decided they were not worth the trouble of killing. Being spared is not always mercy. Sometimes it is a rating. Some agreements die the moment they are made. The people making them simply do not find out for another year. In the flat, sun-bleached country east of the California line, there is a particular category of business that has existed since long before anyone rode a motorcycle through it. Storage. Not glamorous, not violent, not interesting to anyone watching from the outside, just space. Warehouses, ranch outbuildings, empty properties with long driveways and no neighbors, sitting patiently along the roads that connect the border to the interstates. Whoever controls the storage controls the timing, and whoever controls the timing has leverage over everyone above and below them. This is what a group of American bikers thought they had figured out. The pitch was elegant. They were not asking to buy. They were not asking to distribute. They were offering infrastructure, secure locations, trusted personnel, discreet handling for a percentage. It was a service business. It was on paper exactly the kind of arrangement that a large organization should have welcomed because it moved risk off their books and onto somebody else's. For about 18 months it worked. Then the percentage stopped being enough. This is where the story turns, and it turns on something so human that it almost feels inevitable. The men holding the product began to understand exactly how much money was sitting inside those buildings. Not abstractly. Physically, they could touch it. And every week they took a modest fee for guarding a fortune that belonged to somebody they had never met. Resentment in that business does not stay abstract for long. The skimming started small, the way it always does, a fraction here. A repackaged brick there, losses attributed to law enforcement seizures that never appeared in any court filing. Explanations that were plausible individually and absurd collectively. They were not caught by an informant. They were caught by mathematics. The organization they were working for had one of the most sophisticated inventory systems in the criminal world. Not computerized, not written down, but distributed across dozens of people who each held one piece of a figure that only reconciled correctly if everyone was honest. When it stopped reconciling, they did not need a confession. They needed a calculator. What happened next was carried out with almost bureaucratic patience. Nobody stormed a warehouse, nobody kicked in a clubhouse door. Instead, over a period of several months, the arrangement was quietly wound down. Loads were rerouted. New storage was arranged elsewhere. The properties that had been full became empty. And the men who had grown accustomed to a steady, effortless income found themselves standing in vacant buildings with lease payments they could no longer justify. Then came the invoice. That is the only word for it. A figure was communicated, the value of what had gone missing, calculated to a degree of precision that told everyone involved exactly how thoroughly they had been watched. And attached to that figure was a timeline. There was no negotiation. There was no meeting. There was a number and a date. Some paid. some ran. A few disappeared into the kind of silence that families never get an answer about, and the desert is very good at keeping those particular silences. What makes this one worth telling is not the ending. It is the beginning. The moment when a group of experienced criminals looked at an opportunity and saw only what they could take, without ever once asking who they were taking it from. Reputation had insulated them from that question for their entire lives. Everyone they had ever stolen from had been somebody who could not do anything about it. They had finally found somebody who could. Rotterdam does not sleep. Standing at the water's edge on a wet November night, you are looking at machinery that operates on a scale the human eye is not built to process. Cranes the height of apartment blocks moving in slow, automated arcs. Stacks of containers running to the horizon in every color and no color at all. Ships arriving on schedules calculated to the minute. Somewhere out in that steel labyrinth, several 100,000 tons of legitimate global commerce moves every single day. And hidden inside a vanishingly small fraction of it, something else. European chapters of the club had been established for decades by the time cocaine volumes through the northern European ports reached the numbers that made headlines. Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Scandinavia. The patch had roots across all of it, and in the classic pattern, those chapters had built themselves into local nightlife, security, debt collection, and the street-level end of the drug trade. Street level. That phrase is doing an enormous amount of work. What arrived through Rotterdam and Antwerp in the 2010s was not street level. It was industrial. Individual seizures ran into the tons. The organizations shipping it were not sending representatives to negotiate with local motorcycle clubs, because they had something far more effective. They had people inside the ports themselves. This is the detail that broke the old model completely. The cartels did not need a European partner to receive product because they had cultivated their own extraction networks. Dock workers, crane operators, customs personnel, logistics coordinators. Young men recruited out of specific neighborhoods and paid extraordinary sums to pull a single container out of the system before it was scanned. That network had no interest in patches, colors, or the history of an American motorcycle club. It answered to whoever paid, and whoever paid was thousands of miles away. So when biker organizations attempted to insert themselves, to tax the flow, to claim a percentage, to assert the territorial logic that had worked everywhere else, they discovered something genuinely disorienting. There was nothing to tax. The product came out of the port and went directly into a distribution system that had been built in parallel, entirely without them. They were not being cut out. They had never been in. A handful of chapters attempted to force the issue. The results were educational. The people who had actually been contracted to protect those extraction networks were not bar fighters. They were young, extremely violent, extremely disposable, and operating under an entirely different set of rules, one where a contract could be issued on a phone in a language nobody local spoke and executed within 72 hours by someone who had flown in that morning and would be gone by nightfall. You cannot intimidate a person who is not from your city, does not know your name, and will not be here tomorrow. For an organization whose entire operating model depended on being a permanent, visible, unavoidable local presence. The arrival of a genuinely transnational competitor was not a challenge. It was an extinction event for the business model itself. The clubhouses in Amsterdam and Rotterdam and Utrecht stayed exactly where they were. The world moved past them at container terminal speed. There is a version of this story that gets told in bars, and it's always wrong. In the bar version, there is a confrontation. Two groups face each other in a warehouse. Somebody says something unforgivable. Guns come out. It ends the way movies end. The real version is much colder, and it happened in a conference room. By the middle of the last decade, German chapters had spent years building what was, by any measure, an impressive operation. Nightclub security across multiple cities, debt enforcement, extensive influence over the distribution of several categories of illegal product, real money, real infrastructure, real political friction, enough that individual chapters were being banned outright by the German Interior Ministry and forced to remove their insignia in public. That last detail matters more than it sounds. An organization built entirely on the visible display of a symbol had spent years watching that symbol become a legal liability. Members could be identified, cataloged, surveilled, and prosecuted specifically because they insisted on advertising membership. Meanwhile, the organizations they increasingly found themselves competing against had no symbol at all. That is the fundamental structural mismatch, and everything else follows from it. The meeting that gets whispered about took place over a business dinner. On one side, senior figures from a European criminal structure with direct South American supply relationships. On the other, representatives of a chapter that had assumed it was there to negotiate volume and territory. They were not there to negotiate. They were there to be informed. What they were told in substance was that the supply relationship would continue, but the terms had changed. Pricing would no longer be discussed. Territory would no longer be respected as an entitlement. The club would receive product at a set rate, and if the club chose not to accept, 3 other organizations in the same city had already indicated they would. That is the entire confrontation. No weapons, no shouting. Just a man explaining a market position. The men across the table had spent their adult lives in a world where the answer to that kind of pressure was force. And in that room, for the first time, force was not available, because the party applying the pressure did not live in Germany, did not have a clubhouse that could be attacked, did not have members who could be identified, and could not be found by anyone in that building, even if they had tried. You cannot go to war with an address you do not have. Some chapters accepted the terms, some refused and slowly starved, and a few made the choice that has ended more criminal organizations than any rival ever has. They went looking for alternative suppliers in a market where every alternative supplier was ultimately sourcing from the same place. There is no alternative to the source. There is only a longer chain with more people taking a cut. The German operation did not collapse in a night. It hollowed over several years. An organization that had once dictated terms became one distribution option in a crowded market, gradually squeezed between rising legal pressure above and suppliers below who had stopped needing them. Nobody fired a shot. That is what made it so complete. Snow changes how violence sounds. In Copenhagen and Malmö and Helsinki through the 1990s, a conflict unfolded that most of the world never really registered. A war between motorcycle organizations that escalated from bar brawls to automatic weapons to, in one genuinely astonishing instance, an anti-tank rocket fired into a clubhouse. That war ended in a truce, broadcast on television, 2 organizations agreeing publicly to stop killing each other. What almost nobody discussed at the time was why it had started, and the answer was not honor or territory or disrespect. It was supply. Scandinavia in that era was a closed, wealthy, extremely profitable market with a limited number of entry points. Whoever controlled the pipeline controlled everything. The clubs went to war over the right to be the exclusive northern distributor for product arriving from southern Europe, which in turn was arriving from across the Atlantic. Here's the miscalculation. They fought each other for years, spent enormous amounts of money, lost dozens of members to prison and to graves, generated the kind of political attention that produces new legislation, all to win control of a distribution position that their actual suppliers had never guaranteed to anyone. They were fighting over a job that the employer could reassign at will, and the employer was watching, not with concern, with interest, because a violent, high-profile, media-saturated war between distributors is not a supplier's problem. It is a supplier's opportunity. Prices firm up, competitors weaken each other, and by the time a winner emerges, that winner is exhausted, indebted, heavily surveilled, and desperate for product on any terms. The truce that ended the Nordic conflict was celebrated as peace. In supply chain terms, it was something else entirely. It was 2 badly damaged customers agreeing to stop destroying each other so they could both keep paying. In the years that followed, the organizations sourcing from South America did exactly what any rational business would do with a weakened distribution partner. They diversified. New groups appeared in Stockholm and Gothenburg and Oslo, younger, unaffiliated, structured around neighborhoods rather than clubhouses, with no interest in the biker hierarchy and no memory of the war that had defined it. Those groups were given terms. The clubs were given whatever was left. An entire generation had bled for a position that was never theirs to own, against enemies who were never the real competition. While the actual decision was being made somewhere they had never been, by people whose names they never learned. That is the coldest kind of defeat. Not losing a war, winning one and finding out it did not matter. Australia is the most profitable drug market on Earth, and the reason is geography. It is extraordinarily difficult to get anything into the country. Island nation, limited entry points, sophisticated border enforcement, enormous distances, which means that once something does get in, it commands a price that would seem insane anywhere else. Several times the American street value for identical product, that kind of margin attracts everybody. And for a long stretch, the organization's best position to exploit it were outlaw motorcycle clubs, which had established themselves across Australian cities with a density and public visibility that had no real parallel elsewhere in the world. They had the distribution. They had the muscle. What they did not have was a way in. So the arrangement that developed was straightforward. Foreign organizations handled importation. Local clubs handled everything after the container was opened. Each side did what it was good at, and for years the money was extraordinary on both ends. The problem with being the second half of a two-part business is that the first half can learn your job much more easily than you can learn theirs. Getting product into Australia requires shipping expertise, corrupted access at foreign ports, sophisticated concealment, and enormous capital. Selling product in Sydney requires a phone and a network. One of those things takes decades to build. The other takes about 18 months. So the importers built it. They began establishing their own local cells. Small, ethnically cohesive, operationally disciplined groups with direct lines back to the source and no need for a middleman. Those cells did not want a clubhouse. They did not want colors. They did not want a public profile, because a public profile is exactly what gets an organization dismantled in a country with Australia's surveillance capabilities. The clubs never saw it as a threat, because it did not look like one. Nobody was challenging them for territory. Nobody was fighting them for corners. The new groups simply existed quietly alongside them. And then the price the clubs were being charged went up, and the volume they were being offered went down. And the exclusive relationships they thought they had turned out to be nothing of the sort. Some responded with violence, which produced exactly the outcome you would expect: heavy media coverage, aggressive new anti-association legislation, chapters banned, members forced to relocate interstate, and an operating environment that became progressively more hostile to the one thing the clubs could not give up: visibility. Meanwhile, the groups that had replaced them continued doing what they had been doing invisibly on the same product at better margins, for the same suppliers. The clubs had been so busy defending their reputation that they never noticed reputation had become the liability. There's a stretch of Texas where the land is so flat that you can watch weather arrive from an hour away. Through the 2000s, that country became one of the most heavily contested pieces of ground in the hemisphere, not between nations, but between organizations, as a particularly ruthless faction fractured away from its parent group and turned the Gulf Corridor into something closer to an active conflict zone than a smuggling route. What made that faction different was its origin. It had been built around men with genuine military training, special forces backgrounds, tactical education, familiarity with weapons and organization far beyond anything the traditional underworld had produced. They did not think like criminals. They thought like an army. And into that environment, in the way that ambition always finds a way, came proposals from north of the river. Groups looking to establish direct supply. Groups who believed that their existing reputation, their internal discipline, and their willingness to use violence gave them standing. Reputation crosses a border very poorly. The men making those approaches were operating on an assumption that had never failed them domestically, that the threat of organized retaliation would function as a deterrent, that any counterparty would weigh the cost of a conflict and choose accommodation. That assumption requires the other side to be afraid of a fight. They were not afraid of a fight was their core competency. They had trained for exactly that in a professional capacity. They had already fought a full-scale war against another cartel and against the Mexican military simultaneously. And the notion that a motorcycle club represented a meaningful threat was not something they took seriously enough to be insulted by. What happened to the individuals who pushed hardest is not something worth describing in detail. It is enough to say that the message sent back north was designed to be understood without translation, and it was. There were no reprisals. There was no war, because there was no realistic path to one. That is the part that reframes everything. An organization capable of terrorizing entire American counties for 50 years made contact with an organization operating on a completely different scale of capability and violence, and made the entirely rational decision to absorb the loss and never speak of it again. Silence is expensive. Sometimes it is still the cheapest option available. The last one is not an incident. It is a conclusion, and it is still happening. Somewhere in the last 15 years, the largest trafficking organizations in the world stopped thinking of themselves as suppliers and started thinking of themselves as manufacturers with a global distribution problem to solve. That shift is the single most important development in this entire story, and almost nobody outside the business noticed it happen. When methamphetamine production moved to industrial synthesis, precursor chemicals sourced from Asia, superlabs producing tonnage rather than kilos, purity levels that domestic producers could not approach at any price, the economics of the entire North American market inverted overnight. For decades, motorcycle clubs had been genuine producers. That was their actual leverage, the thing underneath the reputation. They made a product. They controlled it from synthesis to street. Then a competitor arrived producing the same substance at higher purity, in vastly greater volume, at a fraction of the cost with an existing transport network already running north. There is no version of that competition that the smaller producer wins. Not with violence, not with territory, not with 70 years of history. It is simply arithmetic, and arithmetic does not negotiate. Think about what that actually meant on the ground. A cook who had spent 15 years perfecting a process, running a lab that could produce a few kilos in a good week, suddenly reading about seizures measured in tons, from a single warehouse in a single operation, with more left behind than he had produced in his entire career. There was no skill gap to close. There was no harder work available. The scale was simply from a different universe. And a man in that position has exactly two options. He can keep producing an inferior product at a higher cost for a shrinking customer base, or he can pick up the phone and start buying from the people who just made him obsolete. So the clubs did the only thing available. They stopped producing and started buying. And the moment they did that, they ceased to be a power in the trade and became a customer in it, which is the exact position every organization in this story eventually found itself in on 4 continents, for the same underlying reason. The final stage is already visible. The organizations supplying them have spent the last decade building direct distribution into American, Canadian, European, and Australian cities using their own people, their own networks, and their own cell structures. Not because they dislike the bikers, because middlemen are a cost, and costs get eliminated. That is the whole story. 10 confrontations across 4 decades, and not one of them was really about disrespect, or territory, or an insult in a bar. Every single one was about the same thing. One organization built its power on being seen. The other built its power on never being seen at all. One depended on a symbol that could be photographed, cataloged, banned, and used as evidence. The other depended on a supply chain that could be rerouted through a different continent in a week. Fear works beautifully right up until the moment you meet somebody who does not need you to be afraid. They just need you to be replaceable. And here's the part that should stay with you. Nothing in this story was resolved by the fight everyone expects. There was no showdown, no final confrontation, no moment where 2 forces met and one walked away. The most consequential defeats in the modern underworld have been administrative. A phone number that stops working, a container that arrives empty, a price that quietly goes up while a competitor's quietly goes down, a relationship that is not ended, just allowed to become irrelevant. That is how real power operates, and it is nothing like the movies. The engines still roll down those highways. The patches are still on the backs. The clubhouses are still standing in a dozen countries, and the reputation still empties a sidewalk in a small town on a summer evening. But somewhere out on the water tonight, a container is moving toward a port, and nobody in that shipping manifest, and nobody waiting at that terminal, and nobody at any point in that chain has spent a single second thinking about a winged skull. That is not a defeat you can fight. That is just being left behind. If this one held your attention, the deeper story is what happened inside those organizations afterward, how they adapted, what they became, and which of them are still standing. That is where this goes next.